Welcome back to The Word at Work. My name's Kyle. It's a huge privilege for me to be working through the book of Proverbs with you. We've seen again and again in these studies really two ways to live, the way of wisdom and the way of folly. And the book of Proverbs has shown us not just the nature of these two ways to live, but the outcome of them as well. Again and again and again, we have seen that the way of wisdom results in life and in flourishing, but the way of folly results in death and destruction. And nowhere is that more evident, perhaps, than in the area of sexual ethics. Now, by the time we get to chapter 7, we've actually encountered this issue of sexual immorality 4 times in the book. It comes up in chapter 2, in chapter 5, in chapter 6, and then again here in chapter 7. But chapter 7 gives it the most extended treatment, and that's why I've waited until now to look at it with you. If we had the time, I would love to spend about 45 minutes working through chapter 7 with you guys, because it gives us remarkable detail into the nature of sexual temptation. But we're not going to be able to do that today. We're going to try and keep this to our usual 10 minutes. And so I'm going to have to ask you to read that passage yourself, go over it carefully, pause the video or the podcast, and can I encourage you just to read over that passage, and then we will jump into it together and look at it briefly. So pause the video or the podcast and have a read of Proverbs chapter 7, and then we'll look together at how temptation works according to Proverbs chapter 7. Well, I hope you found that helpful. It really is a remarkable chapter. And like I said, I'd love to go into more detail with you, but I'm going to have to focus just on a few key highlights. And what I want to particularly highlight is the way in which temptation works according to Proverbs chapter 7. The first thing I want to show is the context of temptation. The context of temptation. Take a look with me at verse 6. The wise person, in the sense the author, is looking out of a window of his house, and the first thing he sees in this context is a personal context, a human context, and in verse 7 we see that it is the simple. The simpleton was first introduced to us in chapter 1, and you might remember when we looked at that the simpleton was a person who was not yet a fool, but certainly was not yet wise either. And the simpleton was vulnerable because of his desires. He desires things that are not necessarily good things, and therefore is vulnerable to those desires and lacks the moral knowledge necessary to avoid temptation and keep himself safe. And so when we see in verse 7 that there is a simpleton on the loose, walking around, we should see that as a warning sign. Things may not end well for this person because he has not made that all-important choice to embrace wisdom. He has stayed in his simple state, if you like. He is a man lacking sense, we're told in verse 7. But notice not just who the person is, notice where he is, verse 8. This young simpleton was passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house. This is the house of a woman who will seduce him. And I think in Proverbs, this is a way of talking generally about sexual immorality. So you could think of this in a gender-inclusive way. It's the sexually immoral person who would seduce and tempt anyone else. And the problem with this young simpleton is not only that he lacks the moral knowledge necessary to resist temptation, but that he can't even avoid temptation because he is right there, close to her house, near to her ways. And think about this carefully with me. Why he's going to experience so much trouble is because his desires have brought him into the orbit of temptation. Right? The desires he has are the reason he is near her corner. His desires are the reason he is taking the road to her house in the twilight, right? At the time of vulnerability and darkness, where things can be done in secret. This would be the same, I think, as someone scrolling the internet late at night on their own with no accountability, desiring to do things in the dark on their own, or seeking to have relationships where others don't know about it, doing things in secret, doing things when others don't know about it. And the interesting thing here with the simpleton is not necessarily that he is looking for this woman, but he is not looking to avoid her. He's not looking for temptation, but he's not looking for it. And so he's vulnerable. So that's the context of temptation. It's not surprising then in verse 10 that this woman meets him. She's dressed as a prostitute, we're told in verse 10. She's wily of heart, loud and wayward. And verse 13, she seizes him and kisses him. She boldly approaches him, and he is unable to resist her. She then starts speaking, and we'll move from the context of temptation to the content of temptation. And what makes Proverbs 7 unique in the book is that in this section here, we are given an insight into her tactics. What are the tactics of temptation? How does temptation really work? Well, listen to what she says to him. She's trying to seduce him with her words and give him reasons for sleeping with her. Verse 14, she says, firstly, she has religious justification for this behavior. Verse 14, I had to offer sacrifices, and today I have paid my vows. She provides a kind of religious justification for this behavior. It's a religious festival. It's time for us to celebrate. It's Christmas Eve, she might say, or he might say. It's time for us to enjoy this special moment. There's not just religious justification, though. There is personal flattery. Take a look at verse 15. There's this time of celebration, so now I have come out to meet you. Verse 15, to seek you eagerly, and I have found you. You, she says to him, I was looking for you. And doesn't that appeal to the pride of this young simpleton? How special he must have felt to be sought out. How his ego must have been flattered by this attention. In addition to this religious justification and personal flattery, she adds sensual attraction. Take a look at verse 16. I've spread my couch with coverings, colored linens from Egyptian linen. I've perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love till morning. Let us delight ourselves with love. She paints an evocative picture of the sensual delights that they'll enjoy. She attracts him with this kind of imagery and appeals to his senses. Again, this is the great vulnerability that the human condition has to the visual, and she appeals to that. Finally, notice, in addition to all of this, she provides a false reassurance. In verse 19, she says, my husband is not at home. He's gone on a long journey. He took a bag of money with him. At full moon, he'll come home. In other words, she's saying, we're not going to get caught. There will be no consequences for this. Now, if you've been tracking with us through the book of Proverbs, you'll know that that is a major red flag, right? One of the key insights in understanding wisdom is recognizing the connection between behavior and outcome, between conduct and consequence. What this woman is saying is that there will be no consequence for our conduct. We'll get away with it. In the end, we'll just enjoy ourselves, and there will be no negative consequences. She provides a false assurance. These are the tactics of temptation: religious justification, personal flattery, sensual attraction, and false reassurance. Again and again and again, these are the things that are used to provide a reason for why people should give in to sin. And so we move from the content of the temptation to the consequence of it. What is the consequence? Verse 21, with much seductive speech she persuades him. With her smooth talk she compels him, and all at once he follows her. The way verse 22 begins, is with a sort of sudden movement. It's like the simpleton has been indecisive and not sure what he should be doing, but then he makes up his mind, and all at once he goes in, he follows her. But take a look at the chilling words of verse 22. As an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a stag is caught fast till an arrow pierces its liver, as a bird rushes into a snare, he does not know that it will cost him his life. You see, he looks for love, but in the end he'll get death. And that is how sin always works, and that is how folly always works. And we've seen that already, haven't we? In chapter 1, the boomerang effect of folly, that it promises life, but in the end it always gives death. And isn't that true throughout Scripture about sin generally? It promises life, but it only delivers death. The only true thing about idolatry is that it always lies and never delivers. The consequences are catastrophic. Unbeknownst to him, he has chosen his own death. Well, what's the conclusion? This is how the chapter ends, with a sobering conclusion, so that we would learn the lessons of this narrative. Take a look at verse 24. Now, O sons, listen to me and be attentive to the words of my mouth. So we know whatever's coming next is going to be incredibly important. What is the lesson of chapter 7? Verse 25, let not your heart turn aside to her ways. Guard your heart above all else. Right? That's what we've heard before. It's what we're being told again. Guard your heart. Don't let your heart be turned aside towards these things. How do you do that? Well, if you look right at the beginning of chapter 7, we're told how to do that. How do we keep our heart? How do we guard our heart? By keeping his words, treasuring up his commands within us, binding these commands on our fingers, writing them on the tablet of our hearts, saying to wisdom, you are my sister, and calling insight our intimate friend. Again and again and again, the protection against folly and against sinful desires is to fill our heart with God's word. So that's the first thing we need to do. We need to guard our hearts. Secondly, though, verse 25 is we need to guard our ways. Do not stray into her paths, we're told. In other words, don't just guard the interior of your life, guard the exterior, guard what's going on inside you, but be careful where you go and what you do and what you look at and what you see. Be mindful of your ways and your paths. So guard your heart, watch your way, and then finally, remember that she promises life, but she delivers death. Verse 26, for many a victim has she laid low, and all her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is the way to Sheol, going down to the chambers of death. This is something that we need to fix in our minds. This is true always of sin and folly, that it promises one thing and delivers something else. It promises life, but it delivers death. It looks like honey, but it tastes like wormwood. Again and again and again, the book of Proverbs will tell us that folly looks attractive initially, but it has a boomerang effect, and in the end will come and hurt us. Chapter 7 is an incredibly important passage. I found it personally very helpful, and I found it pastorally helpful, and I would highly recommend it to you for your meditation and reflection. In Proverbs 7, the tactics of temptation are uncovered for us so that we might understand them and avoid them, and so walk on to the way of life. In verse 2, there's a command to live. That's what is being held out to us here. Won't you live? Won't you enjoy life to the full, life as God has intended it, by embracing his word and bringing it into the depths of your heart, binding it on your fingers and writing it onto the tablet of your heart? Won't you do that? Well, let's seek to do that together. Thanks for joining me. Please do take a look at Proverbs chapter 7, and in our next episode, we'll be wrapping up our series as we look at the final 2 chapters together. God bless.